Cool. So I know there was some interest in seeing like a basic, like 3-column sort of header footer layout. Is that the case? Yes, no, maybe. Yes, cool. Okay, yeah, I think that's going to be good. I think I'm going to go ahead and do that now. And I'm going to make a note to myself. I do need to sort of like time box this task so that we make sure to have enough time to look at all the other fun stuff. But I think this will actually segue pretty well. And I have been adding, a lot of these links are in the curriculum. I'm putting them in the notes of the demos and notes doc as well. Like this learn layout site. The other thing with CSS is no one figures out all of this stuff from scratch. I don't know if anybody ever did, but especially these days, the way everybody does it is you start Googling and finding examples and grabbing pieces. The way to do it is like, if I'm going to copy and use the CSS, and this one is sort of special because it is using Flexbox and CSS Grid, which I'll talk about in a bit. But if you are going to use some HTML and CSS, before you use it, it is really important to take the time to read through it and do the research that you need to understand how it's working. A lot of tutorials out there are not great, to be honest. And there is stuff that you can get rid of for your use case, or there is extra stuff. And if you are just bringing over and copying over large amounts of code, especially with CSS rules, and you don't know what it's all doing, it will become very messy very fast. So finding other resources and using and copying the code is great. But for your own sanity, you should definitely take the time to read through it before you do it. And that's also how you kind of learn this stuff. Like that's how I learned a lot of this stuff. They have, yeah, so they call this the Holy Grail layout. This is a great site. And again, they're using CSS Grid, which makes life a lot easier. And we'll sort of see a bootstrap grid. But again, as a layout example, like a lot of pages fit this kind of layout content of header, footer, and so on. Like, let's see, Google Suite for Business. Let's see what their page layout looks like. Yeah. Header, display block, right? Because we want it to be the full width. Inside there, inline block stuff. Inline block, inline block, inline block. Inside the inline block, an unordered list that is also probably inline block, inline block, inline block. And look how they're using, I want to say it's margin, that sort of orangish color on the left. It's either margin or padding. We can check here. Padding, margin. That's how they're setting up that nice spacing. And note that they just do it on the left because it's kind of flowing and each one kind of stacks on top of each other in the horizontal direction, kind of like stacking horizontally. And that's a pretty core like technique for building CSS layouts. And so I'm going to do my best to kind of whip up the 3-column layout in a minute. And if I crash and burn, we'll press pause. But I think is looking at this useful for folks? I think, yeah, I think it's actually really illustrative. Once you start seeing this, again, this is just a big inline block div, and then we stick some inline or inline block stuff within it. And then it's all living inside this one other div. And they maybe put a little padding on the bottom, or it looks like it's maybe a little bit of shading. And then they've got the body, which is like the whole thing, all the stuff. And within the body, it's all just more divs, probably with block level stuff. They use a bit of padding, it looks like, right, to help center things. We haven't really talked about like the section elements. HTML now has some elements named like section and navbar and stuff like that. And you really use them the same as divs. It's more for semantic reasons than anything that it really does. And note how they've got like 3 layers of divs here. One that kind of holds everything with a bit of padding, another one inside it with more margin, and then another one inside that with more stuff. And then if we go through here, again, block taking up the whole width, but it's actually kind of contained inside this other thing. And that's a really common technique too. Like you stick one thing inside another, but then you don't give it too much room. So it can only like get so big. And then it's just a bunch of vertical rows of stuff. And here they've used a break element to just break out to grow and run your business more efficiently into 2 lines. BR is short for break. And with text, it will put the stuff after the break on a new line. A paragraph tag. Again, it's because it's contained in these other divs that you can then give it all that padding and it's kind of nicely centered. Let's see where they've got those buttons. And again, div, tons of padding, and then 2 sort of inline block style buttons. And here they just, you know, once you start getting really into this stuff, there's a lot of stuff that you add to make it look nice and look right. But I think you folks kind of get the basic idea. Like pretty much any website you look at is going to work that way. Wikipedia is actually a little, because it's primarily text, it's interesting. But here again, sidebar. This is a 2-column layout, really. We've got 1 column here, and it's a skinny column. And then inside it, we stick other divs. And because they're inside it, and because this first column, like we've given it a set width, like we don't let it grow too much, then everything else gets contained. And then this is our other column here that has like the main contents. And this does touch on, because they are using actually a position tag, and we should probably talk about this briefly. And they just have a very nice visual here. So I'm just going to go ahead and show this. Sticky, open and scroll this container. Yeah, so I believe position static is sort of the default. If I do sticky, and this is how on websites, when you see like the header of the page stays there. Let's see if we can look at, how do they show us? They should show us the code for this. That is sort of the missing piece. But essentially it looks like what's happening is this position rule is only applying to this yellow box here. Static is sort of the default. Relative means you can position an element relative to, I want to say, the element next to it. Let's see exactly what it says. Yeah, I'm not gonna, there's it again, like you can go down a big rabbit hole with this stuff. You don't need to use the position attribute too much. Sticky is probably like one of the most common use cases, because that's how you could get like a header to stay. If you absolutely need to put something on the bottom of the page, you can also use the position attribute. position you would generally use to supplement sort of the display properties and the layout that you have. And on that note, let me put together, if I can quickly, like a sort of a 3-column layout. So I've got my index.html. I have a bunch of stuff in it. We'll come back to that. But basically, I think what I'm going to do is, yeah, we're going to have 3 divs. I'm going to use IDs for them. And right now, these divs don't do anything. Let me give it a class. We'll call it layout column. Actually, I might not even need the IDs at all. So I'm just going to get rid of these. And then if I need them, we'll come back to it. I'm going to go ahead and create this CSS class that we're going to use. And just so I can see stuff, I'm going to add border 2px solid black. And right now on our website, there's not really anything in there, so it's pretty empty. And I definitely recommend when you're like writing and figuring out CSS and layout stuff, use borders, colors. Don't be afraid to stick all sorts of stuff in there to help visualize things. So this is great, but right now, these are 3 blocks, right? It's display block, they're all vertical. And that's not what I want because I want 3 vertical columns. So I'm going to go ahead and take my own advice and use DevTools. And I'm getting there, but this doesn't seem quite right either. Oh, and the headings aren't inside the divs. That would be a huge problem. Thank you so much, Zach. I just saw that in the chat. Yeah, I totally am going to make plenty of mistakes demoing code. So if something seems funky, definitely let me know. I appreciate that. And actually, this is also where the format document command is your friend. And now let's see what happens if I just do the display inline block. So that's more like what I want to see. I've got these 3 columns. I haven't put my other stuff inside them yet, but at least the 3 columns are now horizontal because I've used inline block. What's really common is you need some sort of container for layout stuff. So I don't know what I'm going to do with this yet, but I'm just going to call this layout container, and I'm going to put these inside it. And in fact, maybe what I'll do, and in fact, let me go ahead and make the change that I was prototyping.
is container its own tag type, or is it you created a container called, or you're using a div called container to store the columns?
I added on the class attribute for this div, I am using the class name layout underscore container. That's a good question.
Container is not a tag type.
Exactly. It's just, we use the term all the time. Yeah, no, that's a great question, because you do see it everywhere. But as a general rule, anything that's like the value of an attribute, the way that here the string layout container is the value of this class attribute is not something that's baked into the browser or HTML or CSS or anything like that. And here, actually, we're going to do padding left 20 px and padding right. And this is kind of interesting. And this is kind of the cool part of nesting. So it's not working so great for the right side, but on the left side, because the padding is inside the box model, I can use it to kind of squeeze my content. So that's kind of nice. So that's step one. And now the next step is I need to get these columns to take up the full width of the space available, because by default, the way that the box model works is the block for some HTML element for its content, it's only going to be as big as the content. And I'm not sure if this is going to work or if it's the best way, but let's see if we do with 100%, what happens. Yeah, so that was not bad. I don't know exactly why, to be completely honest, but clearly if we set width to 100%, that also like messes with the display property. And if I wanted to, I could like look in here and figure stuff out. And to be honest, I don't want to figure that out. Like a simple hack would be like with 30% or with 33%. We're going to run into weird edge cases where like padding and margin will start to mess this stuff up. So in addition to pixels, there are other units that we can use when specifying sizes of things. Percentage is one, and I believe it's calculated by percentage of the window, essentially the browser window. There are also units, you can also do it as like, I want to say percent of pixels available of the view window. There's also something called Ms and REMs, which is for font stuff. Like if New York Times is a great example, and I'm not going to go too much into it right now, but with print layout, like people really care about how big, people care about how big this font is relative to this font, like the size of the actual font itself. So a .em or REM lets you set a font size relative to some other font size. So if I wanted to make sure that these guys were like 20% the size of this, I could do that by, instead of setting the font size in pixels, in .em or REM. And there's all sorts of specifics and tricks that end up determining what you actually use. But just because we're seeing percents now, I wanted to illustrate that there are a lot of different ways to do it. And I actually am going to Google basic 3-column layout without grid or flexbox, because I am curious if there's a better way to do it than using width. And here it looks like they're using, yeah, the float rule, which we haven't talked about, and which is another good reason to do this maybe. let's take a quick look at the float rule, and we either will use it or discard it. So this is kind of interesting. It places an element on the left or right side of its container. It lets stuff wrap around. It's removed from the normal flow of the page. I'm not sure, to be completely honest, if this is the best way to do our layout. Let's see what happens. Float left. Yeah, that doesn't make a big difference, does it? You get into like weird and interesting rules because the float and then the position rule interact in interesting ways. These days, especially between Bootstrap and CSS Grid and Flexbox, it's less relevant to know those things. It used to be that was the only way to do stuff. So just for now, I'm just going to kind of keep rolling with this example with width, and we're not going to worry about the fact that this will give us some problems as we stick content in there. How does that sound to folks? So this doesn't look like much, but it's going to actually be pretty nice. I do want to add width 30% to my code, and I'm going to go back and refresh the page. And I put that in the wrong CSS rule, so I'm going to fix that. And so now I've got this. And now let's start putting stuff inside our columns and see what happens as we do that. Let's start with this one. And instead of a div, I think I'll just make it a paragraph tag because it's a bit easier to read, makes a bit more sense. Let's put it in column 1. And I'm going to use the format document command and save this. And let's see what this looks like. So now this is starting to get a little interesting. If we take all of this stuff right here, and I'm going to use these little arrows are kind of nice. They will collapse nested stuff. I'm going to copy this whole thing if it lets me. Not quite. I will do it the old-fashioned way. Let's see here. I apologize. I may have confused myself a little bit. Oh, and it looks like we never put the boxes. Okay. Yeah, this is where moving stuff around gets a little tricky, because if you miss a div when you're copying and pasting a lot of stuff, it can be a real pain to find it. So it's always worth just taking your time. We're just going to stick all this stuff in column 2. I'm going to use the format document command to make this more readable. And let's see what things look like right now.
Adam, it's
So
always
this
been my
is-
experience.
Yeah.
It's always been
What
my
is-
experience that you generally only want to change the site's CSS file, and changing things directly or specifically one element is kind of hard to keep track of if you don't do it correctly.
It is like, I mean, I knew everything was contained in that one div that we used to wrap all these boxes. I also knew that the CSS classes that we were using don't really interact with each other. Like all of the stuff that we were using for our boxes, it's really specific to the box itself and is applying to like containing elements. It's when you start using stuff like the position attribute and the float attribute, which like you can use to essentially like break out of the document flow of a page. That's when, if you're moving stuff around, it can get really weird because of how those things work. Which is one reason too to be a little cautious in using those. So this is not terrible, not great. We've got 3 columns. They don't look great. Stuff is contained within each column, which is nice, but the columns are, we kind of want them all at the top. And this actually might be where like a position attribute would be useful. And I'm going to try it. And then if that doesn't work, I will probably have to do a quick Google. Let's see here. And position, absolute, parent, initial, relative, static. Yeah, so that did not work, which is fine. Now our next task is, we've got the 3 columns, but we want, oh, I apologize, that's my timer, but I think we're almost done. So this is good. So we want these 3 columns to be all up at the top, right? And there's a couple different techniques we could use. Like I have all this stuff wrapped in a container. There are some rules I could set on the container that might affect all of the columns within. We wouldn't want to use like margin or padding or anything like that. And honestly, this is where Google is my friend. And I'm just going to Google CSS 3 column layout, all columns at top. Let's see if we find anything useful. And I will say also, CSS is the kind of thing where it's like, if you don't use it, you kind of forget it. And that's kind of okay, because there's so much stuff going on. Here it looks like they're using a float. Here they're using Flexbox, which is the right way to do this these days. Let's take a quick look at the float property. We looked at this before, but it places stuff on the left or the right side. Applies the use of the block layout, block, inline block, Yeah. Oh, I'm sort of looking at the chat too. Could I do a width of column 2, 80% and 10% on 1 and 3? Kevin, that's not a direct solution to our problem, but that is a great suggestion. Basically, Kevin is saying like, hey, this middle column has most of the content, which is how most page layouts are. What if we just give it more space? I don't think that'll change. That might fix it, because probably what is going on here is that this middle column, well, we need to get them all at the top. Kevin, let's try it, and then we'll circle back. And then I think what we'll do is we'll break and we'll look a bit more at responsive web design stuff and Bootstrap. And most of all here, I think the useful thing is to just kind of see the process of working on this. I kind of went into this a little bit on purpose, not remembering how to do this, so we can do a bit of Googling and debugging and see how you would go about that. So here, let's just give this with 10%. I apologize, that's the wrong one. We want to give the column with 10%. We want to give our middle column with, let's do it, 70%. And then this one with 10%. And I want to leave a little room. Yeah, it gets, yeah, the width way, yeah, no, width can get a little funny. Let's see here, CSS put div at Yeah, it might be position fixed, in fact. And fixes it at a predetermined position. And this is honestly what I have to do all the time when I'm working on CSS is like, unless you're doing it all day, there are just a lot of rules to remember. And this is also why just getting comfortable Googling with this stuff is really important. And then when you're Googling, actually reading. And so the interesting part here is we remove it from the flow. It's positioned relative to the containing block. And then its final position is determined by the values of top, left, right, and bottom. So this sounds promising. Let's try it and see what happens. And I don't. Yeah, and this might be the point where I have to pause and yeah, this is a good example of how the position attribute is interesting and weird. Like I added it to this layout column class, which we're using on all these columns, and fixed removes it from the flow entirely. So it's like we're just completely changing the way the rules work. I'm looking in the comment channel. Jason, that looks interesting. I don't know if that's using CSS grid though.
Yeah, I just found that in the holy grail of the the same website that you're on for the pattern layouts. And that's what it shows on that layout for the 3-column.
Oh, nice. Let me take a look there. I suspect. Yeah, so this is using CSS grid, which is a much nicer way to do this. And you folks are kind of seeing why. To be honest, and CSS grid is a relatively new, in like the past 5-ish years, CSS feature. And the way I know that is that there's this parent div class. And when you set the display property on the parent, it is going to be applying this grid display property to its children. And then that's this grid column property that lets us build a grid. And Bootstrap does the same thing. And that's honestly the way to do it. I'll very quickly show folks like.
Adam, will we be
CSS
talking
grid.
more about inheritance and parent-child ideas in CSS?
A little bit. Yeah, it's. I don't think we're going to talk about it a ton. It really becomes relevant, like with certain like display property values like flexbox and grid. Like the way that flexbox and grid work, it kind of depends on, you have to set the display property of like a wrapping container or parent div for all your stuff to be either like flex or grid, depending on what you want to use. And then you can like use all the flexbox or the grid rules inside that. And to be completely honest, I'm not 100% like which CSS properties are inherited and which are not, which is why I'm looking at it right now. And it looks like color is inherited. In general, like especially as your programs gets bigger, you'll depend some on inheritance, but it's nice to be a bit more explicit. And again, with layout stuff, we don't use it as much. So I got us part of the way there. We didn't quite take it home. There's probably one trick that I'm missing, to be honest, using like position in order to get these columns to be vertical. As you can see, what's also interesting is that it's like depends on how much content you have inside and the different rules. So the whole thing is its own funny little world. And honestly, being able to use Flexbox or Grid or Bootstrap is wonderful. And I think, in fact, just to segue a bit, and we'll look at Bootstrap really quick and then like take a break. Bootstrap, and actually let me show you. So like there's a lot of problems. Even if we fix this, there's a lot of problems here. Like if I make this smaller, this content is going to start to look terrible. If I'm looking on an iPhone, this content is minuscule. So this idea of responsive web design is that like the web page will look good, whether I'm looking on a tablet or a phone or my laptop or anything else. And there are a couple things that we can do that do help with that. But I think we'll take a break and we'll start looking probably at Bootstrap, because that's what we're going to use the most. And specifically, let me show with Bootstrap columns and layouts, because this is kind of the fun stuff. Let's see where a good example is. Yeah, I think what I'll do, let's do this. Let's take a break and then we'll make a 3-column layout with Bootstrap Grid. And as you can see here, it's dramatically simpler because it's doing all sorts of stuff under the hood for us. And rather than dive into that now, I think we should take a 10-minute break and let's come back at 11:22 and then we'll take a look at it. So thank you folks for bearing with me. I hope at least watching the debugging process of kind of trying to get a 3-column layout the old school way was useful. And then when we come back, we'll see like the much friendlier new school way to accomplish the same thing. Awesome. Thank you.